Good morning. Happy September, 1st of the month. Kids will be going back to school soon. But it's definitely getting darker. I found definitely darker this morning. I've had to put a light on. And, yeah, it's definitely darker, isn't it? But September, it is, a new month. So today we've got quite a big passage, so bear with me. But it finishes off chapter 5. So Wayne tomorrow will be bringing you chapter 6, the start of chapter 6. But today it is Mark chapter 5, and it's verses 21 to 43. Okay, let's get started. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her. Heal her so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them, but she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She had heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can just touch his robe, I will be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped. She could feel it in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him. So he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me?" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace, your suffering is over." While he was speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling the teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid, just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead, she's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And the little girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened, and he told them to give her something to eat. So, quite a long passage, and it's actually got 2 different stories in the passage. So we start off, so Jesus had been out on his boat, and he was now coming back to Capernaum, and again, crowds and crowds of people around him like there was all the time. And this man, Jairus, he was the leader of the synagogue. He came up to him and told him that his daughter was sick. Jairus' daughter was sick. Now, Jairus was the leader of the synagogue, so he was an important man in the synagogue. And Capernaum was just a small town, so I don't know how important he was overall, but he was in this particular synagogue. Now, if we remember that the plot against Jesus, with the religious leaders plotting against Jesus, was already started. The religious leaders were not happy with Jesus at all, and Jairus would have been a part of that as leaders of the synagogue. So for him to come to Jesus, I mean, he was desperate, you know. I mean, I can't even imagine. I don't even want to have to imagine the situation that he was in. His daughter was deathly ill, and he'd heard about Jesus, obviously, and he was so desperate that he was willing to go to this guy that all the other religious leaders were sort of talking about and complaining about, and trying to get rid of. And he was so desperate, he ran to him and said, please, he threw himself on the floor at Jesus' mercy and said, please heal my daughter. And then as Jesus is going to heal his daughter, there's a big crowd around him. And all of a sudden Jesus says, who touched me? Now, I love this bit because it just shows how human, how normal, how so like us the disciples were. You know, the disciples looked at him and went, really, Jesus, who touched me? You know, there are all these people around and you want us to tell you who touched you. You know, the disciples were probably like, you know, get a load of this guy, because there were so many people around him. But Jesus felt, when the woman touched him, he felt the power leave his body, and he looked around for the woman, and it's the difference in these two people. You know, Jairus came, he went looking for Jesus, and he threw himself down on the floor and begged him to come and heal his daughter. Whereas the woman, she was a bit more reserved maybe, and all she wanted to do was just touch his cloak, touch his clothes, because she knew that if she could just touch any part of Jesus, that she would be healed. And she was. And, you know, these two stories show different ways that we can come to Jesus. You know, Jesus is there for all of us. It doesn't matter who we are, whether we are, you know, quite important people like leaders of the synagogue who, you know, or whether we are just the normal person on the street. And not just that, this woman had been bleeding for 12 years. Now, in Jewish law, when women bled monthly, they had to stay away from people because they were unclean. And to touch somebody who was bleeding was an unclean thing to do. So she would have been a bit of an outcast in her society. She'd spent all her money on doctors trying to fix this, and nobody had been able to heal her. You know, and she just went and she just touched his cloak with everything, all the people around her. So, you know, in our lives today, there's, you know, when things happen, you know, we can either be like Jairus and just look for Jesus, go find him and throw ourselves down on his feet and say, Jesus, please help me. But then there's also, if you don't have that courage, that strength, that you can be like the woman, and just when everything is surrounding you, you just reach out. You can just reach out and you can touch him and he will be there for you. You know, you don't need this big song and dance and all these fancy words and, you know, have to be somebody to approach Jesus. All this woman did was just seek him out, just reach her hand out to touch him. And that's all we need to do. When all the things that are going on in your lives, you might feel overwhelmed and, you know, just completely overwhelmed with everything, that all you need to do is just reach out to touch Jesus and he will be there. He will seek you out. He turned in the crowd and said, who touched me? And he looked for the woman. He will look for you too. All you need to do is just reach out and call for him. Have a lovely Wednesday.